Have you ever looked into an old photograph and felt as though the eyes staring back were trying to tell you something? Tonight's story begins with one such image, a faded daguerreotype from the 1850s, a young girl standing beside her in slaver, her gaze calm but hauntingly aware. For more than a century and a half, her name was forgotten, her life erased from the pages of history, until a quiet discovery, a few faint stitches hidden in the sleeve of her dress, began to whisper of something far greater. What if those threads weren't decoration at all, but a map? A message left by a child who refused to be silenced. From the plantations of Louisiana to the classrooms of Philadelphia, her story stretches across generations of suffering resilience and a truth buried deep beneath the surface. So settle in, because what began as a simple photograph will soon unfold into a tale of courage, secrets, and the quiet defiance of a girl who dared to speak without words. During restoration, the experts discovered something no one had ever noticed before, a secret hidden within the folds of the slave girl's clothing. Dr. Sarah Chen steadied her breath as she positioned the daguerreotype beneath the digital microscope. The silvered plate shimmered faintly under the light, carrying a frozen moment from another century. Before her was a haunting image, a young black girl, no older than 12, standing rigid beside a well-dressed white man before a columned mansion. New Orleans, 1858. The photograph had arrived at the Smithsonian Conservation Lab 3 weeks earlier, a donation from an estate in Baton Rouge. Sarah had been assigned to restore and authenticate it, a task she had done hundreds of times before. The daguerreotype was remarkably well preserved. After 166 years, its surface still caught the light like water. But something about the girl's expression unsettled Sarah. Most enslaved subjects from that era bore vacant, distant looks, the expressionless faces of people stripped of self. Yet this girl's eyes were different. Not defiant, not pleading, but purposeful, intentional. Sarah adjusted the magnification, focusing on the child's dress. It was plain, coarse cotton, the kind given to enslaved children, with a crude collar and long sleeves, despite what looked like summer light. As she scanned for damage along the fabric, something caught her eye, a faint irregularity along the left sleeve. At first, she assumed it was simple deterioration in the silver emulsion. But as she tilted the light, her heart began to race. These weren't random marks. They formed patterns, letters, numbers, stitched so delicately they were nearly invisible. Sarah leaned back, blinked, then looked again. The thread was impossibly fine. Her hands trembled as she reached for the documentation camera. She had restored hundreds of 19th century images, but nothing like this. Now, under magnification, the tiny forms revealed themselves, clearly coordinates. Latitude and longitude carefully embroidered into the sleeve of a child who had no name, no record, no voice. A message left in plain sight, waiting 166 years to be found. Sarah picked up her phone. Her thoughts raced. Whoever had placed those numbers there had wanted them discovered. By morning, she hadn't slept. The coordinates 2995 and 111 News 071 led her to a patch of swampland 30 miles northwest of New Orleans, according to 19th century maps. Today, that area was a protected wildlife reserve near Lake Pontchartrain. At dawn, Sarah brought the daguerreotype into the main conservation theater for verification. Dr. Marcus Williams, head of the department, arrived at 7. A man of deliberate thought, With 40 years of experience authenticating historical photographs, he was not one for wild speculation. "Show me," he said simply. Sarah guided him through every step of her discovery. Marcus adjusted the light. The lenses even pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket. For several long minutes, the only sound was the soft hum of the microscope. Then finally, he spoke. "The thread is period appropriate. Cotton, not synthetic. Stitching style consistent with mid-19th century work." He paused, removed his glasses, and cleaned them, a nervous habit Sarah knew well. But the precision required to create numbers this small. "I know," Sarah interrupted quietly. "It shouldn't be possible. And yet, it's here." Marcus rose and walked to the tall window overlooking the National Mall. "Have you identified the subjects?" Sarah pulled up her notes on the main screen. The donor estate included some records. The man is Nathaniel Duchamp, owner of Belle Rave Plantation 15 miles upriver, a prosperous sugar operation. He died in 1859, just a year after this photo. And the girl, Sarah shook her head. Nothing. She's listed only as enslaved child unidentified. I've searched Belle Rave's surviving archives, birth logs, sale ledgers, everything. Children that young were rarely named unless they were sold. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, staring at the girl's eyes. "She wanted someone to find this," he murmured. And for a moment, the lab felt impossibly still, as though the child herself was listening, waiting across a century and a half of silence. The question was simple. But why? The Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge stood cold and modern, its glass facade reflecting the heavy southern sky, a stark contrast to the century of secrets sleeping inside. Sarah had driven 3 hours from Washington, D.C., with a single purpose: to find any trace of what happened at Belle Rave Plantation between 1858 and 1859. An elderly archivist, Mrs. Beatrice Thibodeau, was waiting when she arrived, soft-spoken with careful hands that had touched more history than most would ever read. Belle Rave was prosperous until Nathaniel Duchamp's death, she explained, leading Sarah to a quiet research room. After that, the property changed hands many times. Most of the plantation's records were lost in the fire of 1891. Sarah's heart sank, most but not all. "There are fragments," Mrs. Thibodeau added gently. "A few letters, a partial ledger from 1858, and this." She placed a small leather-bound journal on the table, its spine cracked but intact. Duchamp's personal diary, donated in 1963 by a distant relative. Few ever read it. Planter diaries are common and often unpleasant. Sarah opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, but still whole, covered in a tight, impatient script. The early entries were mundane: weather, sugar prices, social visits. But then dated August 3rd, 1858, 2 weeks before the photograph, something changed. The girl saw. "I am certain of it." She was in the barn when I returned with the documents, her eyes too intelligent, too aware. I cannot risk her speaking, though who would believe a slave child? Still, I watch her. She works in the house now, where I can see her always. Sarah's pulse quickened. She snapped a photo of the page, then turned carefully to the next entries. August 17th, 1858. The very date stamped on the daguerreotype. Had our portrait made today as planned. The photographer arrived at dawn. I stood with the girl deliberately. Let there be record of her presence should questions arise later. Though I have been careful, one can never be too cautious. The matter is buried and shall remain so. A chill passed through the room. Mrs. Thibodeau, reading over Sarah's shoulder, whispered, "What matter?" "I don't know," Sarah murmured. "But I think this girl was trying to tell us." Back in Washington, Sarah assembled a small team. Marcus Williams brought in Dr. James Foster, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, and Detective Robert Chen, Sarah's brother, who had taken leave from the DC Metropolitan Police. What began as restoration had now become investigation. They gathered in the Conservation Lab's conference room, the daguerreotype projected large on the wall. The girl's face, 10 feet tall and ghost-like in silver light, seemed to watch them. "I've gone through every New Orleans newspaper from 1858 to 1859, James said, spreading old printouts across the table. There was a significant unsolved case that year. A federal marshal, Thomas Beaumont, disappeared July 28, 1858, while investigating illegal slave trading in the Louisiana bayous. Illegal. Robert frowned. Slavery was legal, James explained quietly, but the international slave trade wasn't. It had been banned since 1808. Smuggling still thrived, though especially along the waterways. Beaumont was building a case against several planters, including, he paused, eyes meeting Sarah's, Nathaniel Duchamp. The pieces began to align horribly, inevitably. "Duchamp killed him," Sarah said under her breath. "There's no proof," James warned. Beaumont simply vanished. His investigation died with him. He laid down another newspaper clipping. But look, Duchamp himself died less than a year later, March 1859. Official cause sudden illness. But rumors spread fast. Some said guilt drove him mad. Others whispered poison that someone on his plantation had taken justice into their own hands. Marcus turned toward the whiteboard covered in notes, his voice low. So, July 28th. Beaumont disappears. August 3rd. Duchamp writes that the girl saw something. August 17th, the daguerreotype is made with hidden coordinates stitched into her sleeve. And by March 1859, Duchamp is dead, Sarah finished. The room fell silent again, save for the faint hum of the lab's air system, a sound almost like breathing. Somewhere far beyond time, that girl's eyes still watched them from the photograph, waiting for someone to follow where her coordinates led. The coordinates, Robert said quietly. They have to point to where Duchamp hid the evidence proof of Beaumont's murder. Sarah pulled up a satellite map, the blue-green sprawl of southern Louisiana filling the screen. "It's all wetlands now," she murmured. "Cypress forests, overgrowth, federally protected land. After 166 years, could anything still be there?" Robert studied the map. "Depends on what we're looking for. If it's paper sealed tight, maybe in a container above the old waterline, it's possible. But finding something the size of a briefcase in 30 square miles of swamp." He shook his head. Sarah's eyes flicked to the enlarged image of the girl's face projected on the wall. "She gave us exact coordinates," she whispered. "She risked everything to leave them. We have to try." 3 weeks later, dawn broke pale and heavy over Lake Pontchartrain. Sarah stood at the edge of the dock, the humid air brushing her face. The expedition had taken weeks of coordination permits from the National Park Service Corporation, from local law enforcement, and the expertise of Dr. Raymond Arsenault, a forensic archaeologist from Tulane University, known for excavating historical sites in wetlands. The team assembled quietly. Sarah, Marcus, Robert, James, Raymond, and 2 graduate students. They loaded equipment onto 2 flat-bottom boats, ground-penetrating radar metal detectors, excavation tools, cameras, GPS units. Raymond studied the coordinates. "We're headed about 40 minutes north," he said. Good news elevation, there was slightly higher, probably a natural levee even in 1858. Bad news, we're dealing with a century and a half of sediment and vegetation. The boats glided into the maze of waterways, branches of cypress and Spanish moss, closing overhead like a cathedral roof. The modern world vanished behind them. In its place rose the sound of insects, water, and something else, a quiet, older than the nation itself. Sarah watched the landscape slide by, imagining the girl, nameless, unrecorded, traveling this same path in reverse. Perhaps she had come by small boat, the weight of some terrible secret pressing down on her even then. There, Raymond called. He checked the GPS again. They drifted toward a small island, no more than 30 feet across, thick with palmetto and wild grapevine. "This is it," Raymond confirmed. "We'll scan first. Dig only if we get a clear signal." The team moved methodically. The radar swept over the soil in slow, patient lines. On the monitor, root systems and buried cypress stumps glowed faintly. Then, in the northeast quadrant, something different. A shape. Rectangular. Roughly 4 feet down. "Got something," Raymond said softly. "Man-made. Metal, maybe wood, heavily decayed." They began to dig with care, documenting every layer. The Louisiana heat was suffocating the air so thick it clung to the skin. 2 hours passed before one of Raymond's students gasped a trowel had struck something hard. Raymond knelt beside her, brushing away soil with his fingers, until a dull metallic surface emerged, corroded but unmistakable. It was a box, iron about 2 feet long, sealed once with wax. Sarah's pulse thudded in her throat. Whoever had buried it had done so with precision, deep enough to hide, shallow enough to preserve. "Let's get it topside," Raymond ordered. "We open it in the lab." The conservation lab at Tulane University was quiet, sterile humming, with faint mechanical sound. The iron box sat under bright white lights, still coated in the dark clay of the swamp. Raymond's team worked with calm, reverent precision. Behind a glass partition, Sarah and Marcus watched in silence, while Robert and James crowded near the monitors. Multiple cameras captured every movement as Raymond worked his tools into the rusted seam. The wax seal had long since deteriorated, but it had done its job. The interior unbelievably appeared dry. After 20 patient minutes, a grinding sound filled the room, the lid separating for the first time in 166 years. Inside lay a bundle, wrapped in what was once oilcloth, now soft as dust. Raymond lifted it gently, layer by layer, until the contents came into view. Papers, pages upon pages, still intact. Despite the weight of time, the water, the silence of the swamp pressing down for over a century and a half, the documents had survived. The letter was the first piece they could clearly read, its ink faded but still legible, written in formal, careful script on United States government stationery. James adjusted the intercom and began to read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. From the desk of Federal Marshal Thomas Beaumont, July 25th, 1858. To be delivered to the District Attorney of New Orleans upon my return. I have gathered sufficient evidence to prosecute Nathaniel Duchamp of Belle Reve Plantation for violations of the act prohibiting importation of slaves. Enclosed are bills of sale for 17 African captives smuggled through Barataria Bay in June of this year, as well as correspondence between Duchamp and Captain Henri Mercier of the vessel Nightingale documenting payment of $3,000 for said captives. When he finished, no one spoke. The air inside the observation room grew heavier, as if the words themselves carried the weight of what had been hidden for more than a century and a half. This was it, the evidence that had vanished along with Beaumont. "There's more." Raymond murmured, his gloved hands trembling slightly as he separated the fragile sheets. There were bills of sale exactly as described, a ledger of transactions. And then, at the very bottom, a small leather-bound notebook. Sarah leaned closer, her pulse quickening. "That's the same notebook from the daguerreotype," she whispered. "The girl, she's holding it." Raymond opened the book carefully. Each page was dense with columns of numbers, dates, and initials. "It's a smuggling record," he said. "Duchamp's own accounting prices, shipments, origins. If Beaumont had brought this to court, Duchamp would have been ruined," Marcus finished quietly. "Imprisoned. Maybe hanged." Robert exhaled, leaning against the glass. "So Duchamp killed him. Took everything, buried it deep enough to vanish forever. But the girl saw. She knew what he'd done, and somehow she found a way to leave us a map to the truth." James glanced between the opened box and the faded daguerreotype displayed beside it. "Look how Duchamp posed her. She's holding the evidence of his crimes right there in her hands. He thought he was flaunting his power, showing that even if she knew she was helpless. But she wasn't," Sarah said softly. "She found a way." With Duchamp's guilt now confirmed, Sarah became consumed by a single question. Who was the girl? She dove back into the fragile remnants of Belrev's records, scouring every surviving document that mentioned a child between 10 and 14, living on the plantation in 1858 at the Louisiana State Archives. Mrs. Thibodeau, sharp-eyed and tireless, joined her search. Together they compared plantation inventories, tax ledgers, even old baptismal registers from nearby parishes. Weeks passed before they found it, a nearly ruined ledger from 1857. Sarah's hands shook as she read the entry aloud. Purchased from the estate of Widow Mercier, one girl child approximately 11 years of age, skilled in needlework and house duties. Price $400. Name given as Deline Mercier. Mercier, Sarah breathed. The same name as the ship's captain in Beaumont's letter. Mrs. Thibodeau was already riffling through another folder. The Mercier were prominent in New Orleans. Henri Mercier was a merchant captain, but his mother, Widow Catherine Mercier, ran a dressmaking shop. Employed enslaved seamstresses famous for their exquisite embroidery. She looked up, eyes wide. Those stitches, the microscopic ones, they were her mark. Everything aligned in a chilling symmetry. Delphine, once Deline, had been trained in the widow's workshop, her hands skilled enough to weave code into thread. When the widow died, the girl had been sold to Duchamp, her new master working alongside the very son whose ship trafficked human lives. She would have known their dealings, Sarah murmured. Heard names, seen letters. When Duchamp took Beaumont's evidence, when she saw that notebook, she understood exactly what it meant. Mrs. Thibodeau hesitated. "You're saying an 11-year-old child understood federal law and smuggling. She understood survival," Sarah said softly. "People like her saw everything. They had to." Marcus arrived from Baton Rouge with another piece of the puzzle, a copy of Duchamp's will. When he died in March 1859, Marcus said, spreading the paper on the table, his property was sold to cover debts, including his slaves. There was an auction on April 15th. Sarah's eyes scanned the brittle page. Then, there. Deline, age 12, sold to a buyer listed only as J. Morrison, New Orleans. Her voice trembled. The trail hadn't ended, it had merely changed names, slipping into another life. And as the room fell into silence once more, one quiet question lingered in everyone's mind. Who did she become? And did she ever tell her story again? The trail went cold after that. Morrison. The name was a dead end, one of the most common in Louisiana, as Mrs. Thibodeau reminded her with a sigh. Yet Sarah couldn't let go. She felt closer to Delphine than ever, the girl who had risked everything to reveal a murderer, who had hidden coordinates in nearly invisible stitches, who had been forced to pose with the very evidence of the crimes she witnessed. "We need to find what happened to her," Sarah said softly. "She deserves to have her full story told." The search for Delphine's fate drew Sarah to the Louisiana division of the New Orleans Public Library, where rows of microfilm reels preserved the city's antebellum records like ghosts waiting to speak. For 3 long days, she scrolled through endless columns of names. Morrison, 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 until her tired eyes blurred. Then suddenly, one name made her sit upright. Jonathan Morrison, a school teacher. When she cross-referenced the name, Sarah's pulse began to race. He had been a documented abolitionist, one of the few in New Orleans who had dared to criticize slavery openly in local newspapers. Robert's voice crackled through the phone when she called. "But abolitionists didn't buy slaves," he said. "That would have been impossible for them morally. Unless," Sarah countered, "they bought people to free them." It was rare, yes, but history had recorded such acts of quiet rebellion. Some abolitionists had attended auctions, not as buyers of flesh, but as liberators. Sarah tracked Morrison's 1859 address to a narrow home on Dauphine Street in the French Quarter. The building still stood, its walls worn by time, now divided into apartments. But the current owner, curious about her research, allowed Sarah access to its old property files. In the dim basement archive, she opened a wooden file box layered with dust and silence. Inside, tied with a brittle ribbon, she found it notarized manumission papers dated May 2nd, 1859. Freeing one female child of African descent, approximately 12 years of age, purchased at auction for the express purpose of granting freedom. Name Delphine. Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth. But there was more attached to the papers, was a letter in Morrison's own hand, the ink browned with age. "This child came to me under circumstances most unusual. At the auction, she approached me directly, an act of extraordinary courage, and spoke words that still haunt me. I know where the truth is buried." She would say nothing more in that public place. But when privacy allowed, she told me a story of murder and hidden evidence, so detailed, so precise, that I could not dismiss it. I have reported her account to federal authorities, though I fear little will come of it, now that Duchamp is dead and beyond justice. Nevertheless, I have freed this remarkable child and arranged for her education and care, with the family traveling north to Philadelphia, where she might have the life her intelligence and courage deserve. Sarah sat back, tears welling in her eyes. Delphine had survived. She had been freed. She had told her truth, and someone had listened. But Sarah wasn't finished. Not yet. If Morrison had sent her north, then perhaps the next chapter of Delphine's life waited in Philadelphia. At the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Dr. Angela Wright, a patient archivist with a historian's intuition, helped her navigate the city's records. If she arrived in late 1859, Dr. Wright said she might appear in the 1860 census for Philadelphia's black wards. Hours passed as they searched through the names of hundreds of free families, escaped slaves, and newly liberated children. And then there it was, Deline Morrison. Aged 13, she had taken her liberator's surname. Listed as a ward in the household of Frederick and Martha Wilson, both free black residents who operated a boarding house on South Street. Dr. Wright's eyes lit up as she recognized the name. The Wilsons were prominent, she said. Frederick Wilson was a conductor on the Underground Railroad and a member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. Sarah stared at the old census record, glowing faintly on the screen, her voice a whisper. She found freedom, she said, and she found people who understood what she'd done. But even then, a quiet question hung in the air. Did Delphine ever tell anyone her story again, or did she at last allow the past to rest in silence? It was exactly the kind of home that would have opened its doors to a freed child. The Wilsons were known for their kindness, their quiet defiance, and their belief that every young life carried potential. From there, the trail of Delphine's life began to unfold, not through rumor or legend, but through records written carefully in fading ink. In the 1865 membership rolls of Mother Bethel AME Church, her name appeared Delphine Morrison. 2 years later, in 1867, she was listed among the students at the Institute for Colored Youth, one of the first schools in the nation to offer a classical education to black students. And then, in 1872, Sarah found something that made her stop breathing for a moment, a marriage record. June 15, 1872. Delphine Morrison, age 25. Occupation school teacher, married Jacob Reynolds instructor at the Institute for Colored Youth. She became a teacher. Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. After everything she endured, she chose to teach. Dr. Wright was already typing rapidly, eyes scanning birth records. If she married in 1872, she murmured, there may have been children. Moments later, she smiled softly and turned the screen. Samuel Reynolds, born 1873 parents, Jacob and Deline Reynolds. Over the next hour, they found 3 more children, each name a quiet continuation of Delphine's story. The Reynolds family had remained in Philadelphia, part of the city's growing black middle class. Jacob had become principal of the institute. Delphine had taught there for over 30 years. When Dr. Wright finally located the death certificate, she spoke with reverence. Delphine Reynolds passed away in 1921, age 74. Buried at Eden Cemetery beside her husband and 2 of their children. Sarah sat in silence, absorbing the full arc of that life. From an enslaved child who witnessed murder to a teacher who shaped generations of students. From a whispered secret sewn into a sleeve to a legacy carried through time. The coordinates Delphine embroidered weren't just evidence, they were defiance. They were her way of saying, "You cannot bury the truth forever." "Are there descendants?" Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Wright smiled. "Let me make some calls." 6 months later, sunlight poured through the high windows of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The traveling exhibition had drawn a crowd to New Orleans. Historians, families, children, each face illuminated by the soft glow of the display case. There it was. The daguerreotype of Delphine and Nathaniel Duchamp, restored and framed in a place of honor. Beside it, the documents recovered from Lake Pontchartrain, the evidence she had helped preserve with nothing more than her courage and a needle. But Sarah's attention wasn't on the exhibit, it was on the people gathered before it. 3 generations of Delphine's descendants traced through months of genealogical work by Dr. Wright and her volunteers. 12 of them, in all elders, parents and children, stood quietly before their ancestors' image. The eldest, Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, held a sepia photograph of her grandmother, Delphine's youngest daughter. The resemblance was striking, the same sharp, watchful eyes, the same quiet intelligence. "We always knew she came from Louisiana," Mrs. Harrison said softly. "We knew she'd been born enslaved. But we never knew this. We never knew what she did, how brave she was." When Marcus spoke to the gathered crowd, his voice carried through the hall. Delphine was only 11 when she witnessed a murder. When she understood that the truth of that crime and of a greater conspiracy was being buried to protect power. She had no voice, no rights, but she had intelligence, courage, and extraordinary skill. She left a message hidden in plain sight, trusting that one day someone would listen. He gestured toward the photograph. For 166 years, she stood here beside her enslaver, holding the evidence of his crimes in her small hands, and in thread so fine it was nearly invisible. She told us where to find the truth. The descendants gathered around the image, fingertips brushing the glass, whispering to the girl who had given them this inheritance, the gift of knowing her strength, her defiance, her will to endure. A small boy, perhaps 5 years old, tugged gently at Sarah's sleeve. "Is that really my great-great-great-grandma?" "Yes," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. "And she was one of the bravest people who ever lived." He studied the photograph for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Why did she hide the numbers in her dress?" Sarah smiled, the kind that holds both sorrow and pride. "Because sometimes, when you can't speak the truth out loud," she said, "you have to find another way to tell it." And she knew that someday, someone like you would want to hear her story. The boy nodded thoughtfully and rejoined his family, leaving Sarah standing alone before the glass. Delphine's face gazed back, no longer nameless, no longer forgotten, no longer silenced. After 166 years, the photograph had finally spoken, and the truth Delphine had risked everything to protect would never be buried again.